Once, nestled in a quiet valley shrouded by ancient forests, meandering rivers, and the slow erosion of time, there lay a small, almost forgotten village. Its people lived humbly, with few needs and even fewer distractions, but with a deep, unspoken agreement that their survival hinged on one thing: a bridge. Old, wooden, and delicate, the bridge was their only connection to the world beyond. Season after season, year after year, it endured, withstanding floods, bearing the weight of snow and time, surviving both peace and the chaos of distant wars. It held firm until one day the air shifted, a stillness settled, clouds gathered with unfamiliar weight, and the elders spoke in hushed tones of a storm that would be unlike any they had ever known. For the first time in living memory, the bridge groaned under its own age. The wood cracked, the ropes, once taut and strong, frayed before everyone's eyes. There was no more denying it. The bridge would not survive what was coming. The villagers met in the great hall, their voices bouncing off the wooden beams in waves of rising concern. From the crowd a few rose: builders, visionaries, people unafraid to imagine what lay beyond fear. "We must act," they urged. "Now, not tomorrow. We must build something new. It won't be easy, and it won't be safe, but if we hesitate, we risk everything." Then came the softer voices, the careful ones, the hesitant. "Let's not rush," they whispered. "What if we make it worse? What if it collapses anyway? What if the storm passes and we've built in vain?" So they waited. Plans were drawn up, discussed endlessly, but never put into motion. Decisions were postponed, diluted until they meant nothing. Those eager to act were told to slow down, to be considerate. The willing were cautioned to weigh the risks. And so strength was gradually muted under the guise of fairness. When the storm finally arrived, it screamed through the valley with no mercy. The bridge shattered, splintered wood vanished downstream, the path to safety was gone. Trapped, the village fell silent, not the peace of calm, but the silence of despair. Supplies dwindled, hope thinned, and those who had once pleaded for delay now looked around with regret in their eyes. "We only wanted to protect everyone," they said softly. "Our intentions were good, but good intentions couldn't rebuild what had fallen. Their fear, their caution, their softness, it hadn't saved lives. It had cost them. This is how weakness triumphs. Not through force, not through betrayal, but through stillness. Through the paralysis of inaction, disguised as wisdom. Through fear, cloaked in kindness. Through the gentle but firm voices that never say 'I can't,' but always whisper 'You shouldn't.'" Nietzsche saw this. He loathed it. Not out of contempt for the fragile, but because he understood what happens when fragility begins to shape what is permissible. When those too afraid to act are given authority over those who would. For him, weakness wasn't merely an absence of strength. It was a parasitic force, hiding behind virtue, behind compassion, cloaked in morality, quietly dragging down all that dared to rise. That village never healed. Its ruins became a metaphor, and in many ways we still live there, surrounded by crumbling bridges, hesitating, listening to the softest voices because they feel safest, mistaking caution for wisdom. But Nietzsche was not interested in safety. He was not a comforting voice. He was a storm, a raw force that tore away illusion, that refused to be quieted for the sake of comfort. And in a world increasingly seduced by compromise and collective softness, he became a threat, not because he despised people, but because he saw what they were becoming. He lived most of his life in pain, isolated, misunderstood. He lost his father young, abandoned his faith even younger, and ultimately his mind unraveled. But before the collapse came fire. His ideas tore through the sacred pillars of his age: religion, democracy, compassion. He didn't believe we had built our world on truth. He believed we had built it on excuses, on systems designed to comfort the incapable and punish the exceptional. He didn't loathe weakness of the body. He felt no contempt for the poor, the sick, or the broken. What ignited his fury was weakness that wore the costume of morality, that whispered sweetly while poisoning the roots of greatness. Most people, he believed, don't truly seek truth. They seek comfort, affirmation. They crave being told that their limits are virtuous, their fears are wise, their lack of ambition somehow noble. So they cling to ideas that shield them from growth. They elevate values that punish strength, shame success, and sanctify suffering. Nietzsche called this slave morality, a moral system not born from courage but from resentment, not from clarity but from envy. And the tragedy, it worked. He wrote, "He who despises himself still respects himself as one who despises," meaning even those too frightened to rise still need to feel powerful. So rather than rise, they destroy. Rather than build, they condemn. Rather than lead, they judge. Nietzsche didn't see this as just a psychological issue. He saw it as a spiritual disease, a force that, if left unchecked, would corrode entire civilizations from within. Because when weakness becomes the moral compass, strength no longer inspires, it becomes something that must apologize for existing. To understand Nietzsche is to peer into a mind that never turned away from pain, that refused the easy comfort of self-deception, that stood against the quiet decay of a world that had grown afraid of its own potential. He asked one brutal question: what if everything we call virtue is just fear in disguise?
We've been taught to hold the suffering in reverence, to see pain not just as something to be acknowledged, but as something to be admired. The victim isn't merely someone to protect. They're elevated, idealized, assumed to possess a truth that the unbroken cannot comprehend. But Nietzsche saw something darker beneath that idea. He warned that when victimhood becomes moral capital, it turns into both shield and weapon. It becomes a means to deflect criticism and simultaneously attack greatness. Weakness, when sanctified, becomes untouchable, and strength, once noble, becomes suspect. It always starts subtly: a remark made at a meeting, a sarcastic smile when someone shares a dream. You mention a goal, an idea, a vision, and someone replies with a gentle laugh. That's a bit much, isn't it? They call it humility. But if you listen closely, you'll hear the sting. It's not humility. It's envy, dressed in virtue. They praise modesty, not because they believe in it, but because they cannot match your fire. So they try to dim it. This is the quiet lie of the good victim. It whispers that suffering proves goodness, that failure means you weren't really trying, that ambition is arrogance, and confidence is cruelty. Nietzsche loathed this lie, not because it was loud, but because it was seductive. It didn't crush with violence, it corroded with softness. It didn't shout down power, it quietly made the powerful ashamed of themselves. Over time, entire cultures began to feel guilty for wanting more. He wrote a line that cuts to the bone: calling something evil is often just the cry of the defeated. That's the deception. When people fall short, when they fail, they face a choice. They can accept it, learn from it, rise from it, or they can twist the meaning of success itself. They can claim that what they couldn't have wasn't worth having. I could have done that, they say, but I'm better than that. And the crowd nods, because we've been conditioned to confuse passivity with virtue. But Nietzsche wasn't interested in appearances. He asked where these beliefs came from, and time after time, he found the same emotion beneath the mask: resentment, not compassion, not grace, not humility. Resentment, boiled down envy, turned into morality. He saw how it poisoned ambition, mocked confidence, and punished excellence. This is the root of decay. When we celebrate the wounded, not for what they've endured, but because it makes us feel morally superior to those who succeed, we're not showing kindness. We're just avoiding the discomfort of our own potential. We're rewarding those who retreat. Nietzsche believed true compassion doesn't lie. It doesn't romanticize pain. It doesn't pretend that suffering is noble. It lifts people out of the pit, not crowns them for sitting in it. The strong shouldn't be punished for standing. The vulnerable deserve help, but not a throne. Because the moment we exalt helplessness, we start punishing those with the will to act. And soon, no one dares to move at all. Let's shift to another allegory. There was once a city perched on the edge of a mighty mountain. It had no rulers, no kings, only a trial. Each year, the people were challenged to climb the mountain. Only those who reached the summit could speak in the council. The trial was brutal, yes, but it was fair. The ones who led had faced their own fear. They had earned their voice, and for generations the city thrived. It wasn't flawless, but it was alive. It was real. Until one day, a man tried to climb and failed. He grew bitter. He claimed the system was rigged. "Not everyone is born to climb," he said. "The rules are unjust." At first, he was ignored. But over time, others who had also failed began to rally behind him. Together, they reshaped the narrative. "The climbers aren't wise," they said. "They're arrogant, selfish, elitist." Slowly the city listened. The trials were abolished. The summit became a symbol of oppression. The mountain was renamed the Wall of Tyranny. People cheered. "No more inequality," they said. But no one noticed that with the end of the trials came the end of leadership. No one dared. No one rose. Effort was replaced with comfort. Pride gave way to fear. A new morality emerged, one that saw striving as shameful, standing out as betrayal. The mountain still loomed over the city, but no one looked up anymore. Nietzsche would call this slave morality in action. When the powerless cannot rise, they don't confront strength, they redefine it. They don't reject greatness, they recode it as evil. In this new code, ambition becomes greed, confidence becomes vanity, pride becomes sin, and meekness, submission, passivity. These are the new virtues, not because they're noble, but because they protect the masses from facing their own insignificance. They burn down the summit, not to build a better path, but to feel better about never climbing. Nature makes this division plain. There is master morality, and there is slave morality. Master morality is rooted in strength. It says, "I am powerful, therefore I act." It builds, it creates, it affirms the self. Slave morality is born from resentment. It says, "I am weak, therefore power is evil." It doesn't create, it criticizes. It doesn't rise, it conforms. The most dangerous part, it works. Slave morality appeals to the weary, the fearful, the tired many. It builds a world where greatness itself is suspicious, where truth gives way to comfort, where power is not just questioned, but demonized. Nietzsche wrote, "Morality is the herd in the individual. What we often call virtue is just the survival instinct of the crowd, concerned not with truth, but with security, not with excellence, but with uniformity." So ask yourself, how many of your values were born from courage, and how many are just fear in costume? Pride, ambition, intensity, confidence, are they really dangers, or are they just reminders of what most people abandoned long ago? Because in a world ruled by slave morality, goodness isn't about growth, it's about comfort. It's about obedience. It's about hiding your fire so no one else feels cold. And if you've ever felt you had to shrink yourself just to be accepted, then maybe without realizing it, you've already been living by their rules. But what happens when someone refuses? When they choose not to apologize for their fire? When they stop obeying? That, Nietzsche would say, is the beginning of something entirely new. There is a kind of pain that doesn't cry out. It smiles. It whispers just enough to sound thoughtful, measured. But if you listen carefully, beneath the gentleness, there's acid. A quiet bitterness from those who never climbed, who now live to hold others down. Nietzsche had a name for this sickness of the soul: resentment. Not just resentment, but a deeper, more insidious force. It's what happens when someone feels powerless to overcome their frustration. So instead of facing it, they transmute it. They twist their pain into a set of moral principles that punish others for what they themselves couldn't become. They say, "That thing I couldn't do, it's not worth doing. That dream I never dared chase, it's wrong to chase." They invent a code where ambition is suspect, confidence is arrogance, and power must be masked or renounced. They dress fear in virtue's robes. You've seen this before. Someone tries, fails, and then decides that the very pursuit they failed at is meaningless. Success isn't everything, they say. I'm not ambitious, I'm wise. I'm not afraid, I'm just grounded. It sounds like maturity, but it's not. It's a defense mechanism, a mask. Resentment is not honest pain. It's polished, selective, weaponized. It doesn't want healing. It wants revenge. It wants to watch the confident stumble, the daring give up. Because when you're stuck at the bottom, someone else's ascent feels like an insult, unless you can drag them back down. That's the function of resentment, to level the field, not by climbing, but by punishing the climber. It builds moral systems that reward submission over sovereignty, compliance over vision, self-pity over self-mastery. Nietzsche saw this as a sickness of civilization, a slow spiritual rot that hid behind smiles. He wrote, "Nothing burns more deeply than the fire of resentment, because this fire doesn't explode. It simmers, it lingers. It infects not just individuals, but movements, institutions, entire cultures. It breeds a world where strength must be explained, where power is suspicious, where even excellence must apologize for existing. A world where every step forward is seen as a betrayal to those who stayed behind. What if those who preach the loudest about humility are just angry? They were never given power. What if those who call ambition toxic are simply lamenting their own mediocrity? It's not about cruelty, it's about honesty. Nietzsche didn't hate the bitter because they failed. He hated the lie they told themselves afterward. He hated how they rewrote their stories to appear virtuous, how they masked stagnation as morality, because resentment is more than a feeling. It's a worldview, and once it takes root, it seeks not truth, but revenge. It doesn't scream. It kneels. It smiles. It cloaks itself in compassion, in sensitivity, in the language of kindness, and when it convinces the world that its wounds are sacred, its pain becomes a weapon no one is allowed to question. This, Nietzsche warned, is its most dangerous form, when bitterness becomes holiness, when guilt replaces truth, when cowardice adopts the name morality, and everyone believes it. There was a moment in history when resentment stopped being personal and became sacred, ritualized, institutionalized, divine. For Nietzsche, nowhere was this clearer than in the rise of Christianity. To him, Christianity was not a religion of love. It was a revolution of the weak, a clever inversion of values, crafted not out of spiritual insight, but out of resentment. Strength, clarity, ambition, these were turned into sins. Submission, meekness, and suffering, these became the new path to salvation, not because they were good, but because they were useful. Forgiveness, mercy, turning the other cheek, these weren't signs of enlightenment. They were tools. They allowed the powerless to gain moral leverage over those who held real power. If they couldn't defeat the warrior or the king, they would call him evil. If they couldn't rise, they would sanctify their fall. Nietzsche didn't see the early Christians as saints, but as tacticians, spiritual revolutionaries, driven not by love, but by bitterness, wrapped in doctrine. He wrote that Christianity was born not from divine revelation, but from the spirit of resentment. Seen through that lens, everything changes. Pride becomes the original sin, desire becomes temptation, strength becomes oppression, and suffering becomes sacred. Not something to endure and overcome, but something to worship. What was once noble, ambition, creation, independence, was now considered dangerous to the soul, and those who surrendered, who erased themselves, who turned to dust, they were promised everything. To Nietzsche, this wasn't salvation, it was sabotage, a spiritual collapse disguised as grace. Christianity didn't elevate the soul, it taught it to kneel. It didn't free the human spirit, it shamed it for existing. Life itself became a burden, and that burden was called holy. But the terrifying part, it worked. It built empires, not with swords, but with guilt. It shaped generations of people who no longer dared to strive, who viewed suffering not as a challenge, but as proof of virtue. And for Nietzsche, that was not progress, it was decay. Because if the future belongs to the apologetic, the ashamed, the obedient, then the soul of man has already collapsed. When weakness is sanctified, it no longer needs to grow, it only needs to be protected. And once suffering becomes a symbol of moral superiority, a disturbing question rises from beneath the surface. What happens when pain becomes power? Nietzsche feared this with intensity, because after slave morality took root, and after Christianity transformed meekness into divinity, came something even more corrosive: pity. Not real compassion, not strength reaching down to lift the fallen, but pity as performance, pity as a weapon. You've seen it, we all have. Someone lashes out, criticizes, offends, and the moment you respond, they retreat into fragility. Don't be harsh. I've suffered too much. I'm dealing with so much right now. They weaponize their pain to deflect consequences. They gain control, not by standing strong, but by collapsing strategically. Nietzsche called this moral blackmail, a script that flips the roles. Now the one who challenges becomes the villain, and the one who manipulates through victimhood becomes untouchable. He wrote, "Pity is the most dangerous poison, because it infects both the pitied and the one who pities. It paralyzes action, it clouds judgment, it replaces truth with emotion and responsibility with softness." Nietzsche didn't despise empathy. What he feared was pity, used to control. When people demand the world shrink to accommodate their refusal to grow, when every expectation is oppression, when every standard is violence, in such a world, you're no longer allowed to be strong. You can't speak clearly, you can't hold a line, because if your truth hurts someone's feelings, you're the aggressor. But real compassion does not flee from pain. Real strength doesn't coddle, it builds, it challenges, it helps people rise, not settle deeper into their wounds. Nietzsche envisioned a world where pain becomes fuel, not currency, because the moment we reward fragility, we begin punishing potential, and the more we glorify helplessness, the more helpless we all become. After tearing down the scaffolding of religion, pity, obedience, and inherited morality, Nietzsche was often painted as a destroyer, a nihilist, a prophet of chaos, who wanted to burn everything and leave nothing in its place. But that's not the full picture. Beneath the fire, there was something else. A vision, a path, a kind of redemption. And Nietzsche believed that redemption had only one name: self-overcoming. If there was a virtue Nietzsche held sacred, it wasn't kindness, it wasn't faith, it wasn't even justice. It was the ability to transform suffering into strength, to look pain, failure, disappointment in the face, and instead of retreating, to absorb it, use it, rise above it. To him,
The truly powerful weren't those who controlled others. They were those who conquered themselves, who faced their instincts, their doubts, their chaos, and from that forged meaning, not borrowed meaning, not collective values, but inner law. They didn't beg for permission. They didn't ask to be understood. They walked their own path, and in walking, created their own values. That for Nietzsche was the highest act of human existence, not submission to an external truth, but the forging of an internal one. This is the true meaning of the Übermensch. Often misunderstood as a tyrant or a warlord, the Übermensch is not someone who dominates the world. It is someone who is no longer dominated by it. He does not compare. He does not conform. He creates, not empires, but purpose, not laws, but life. Nietzsche wrote, "Become who you are." It sounds simple, but it's among the most brutal instructions ever given, because to become who you are, you must strip away every comforting lie, every inherited virtue, every fear you've disguised as a principle. You must face your contradictions, your wounds, your desires, and stop apologizing for them.
Self-overcoming is not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. It's about aligning your will with your actions, your thoughts with your instincts, your life with your truth. It's not peace, it's tension, but it's real, and Nietzsche believed that without it, humanity decays. We shrink, we rot beneath the weight of virtues that never belong to us. We mold ourselves to the fears of others and call it morality. But to overcome the world, you must first overcome yourself. That was Nietzsche's message. Don't live by the rules of the herd. Don't obey morality simply because it was passed down to you. Don't apologize for your fire. Stand alone in the storm and rise anyway. That to him was redemption. That to him was power. And now, after the storm, after the lies, after watching truth be replaced by comfort, we return to the question that haunted the very beginning. Can you trust the weak? Not those physically fragile, not those who endure pain with courage, but the spiritually weak, those who refuse responsibility, those who weaponize morality to justify their fear, those who build nothing but demand everything, those who shrink from action but want to lead others. Can you trust someone who won't even stand up for themselves, to stand for you? Nietzsche didn't ask this question to be cruel. He wasn't mocking those who struggled. His fear was not fragility. It was the moment when fragility gained authority, when victimhood became a throne, when guilt replaced truth, when fear wrote the laws and was obeyed. Because in that world, the strong are not just questioned, they are condemned. Ambition becomes a sin. Confidence becomes a warning sign. Honesty becomes violence. And life, vital, burning life, becomes a threat, simply because it dares to rise.